My millionaire father made my husband CEO before he died. 2 years later, my husband filed for divorce, claimed he owned everything, and walked into court not knowing what my father had left behind. The moment I knew my marriage was truly over wasn't when the divorce papers arrived. It wasn't when I drove past the building my grandfather built with his bare hands and saw the new sign above the entrance, Gale Enterprise Group, in clean sans serif letters that had nothing to do with anything my family had ever been. It wasn't even when my daughter Georgia sat at my kitchen table, jaw tight, staring at a newspaper photograph of her father posing at her grandfather's desk like a man who had always belonged there. It was a phone call. Henry's voice, careful and almost gentle, the way a person sounds when they've rehearsed what they're about to say enough times that it no longer sounds rehearsed. He told me I didn't want this to go to a hearing. He said it like he was doing me a favor. Then he paused, that particular kind of pause where a man decides he's comfortable enough to say the real thing. And he said, "This company started with a mop and a bucket, Cresa. Low-level work. I made it respectable. You were never really built for those rooms." Georgia was at the table. Her hands went flat on the surface. I looked at the phone. "Okay, Henry," I said, and I hung up. Then I opened the kitchen drawer and took out the note my father had left me, and I dialed a number I hadn't called in 2 years, and a man named August Delmore picked up on the second ring, like he'd been waiting. "Let me tell you about my father, because nothing that comes after makes sense without him. Franklin Cousins, Frank to everyone who knew him, though he signed everything with the full name, in the careful, deliberate cursive of a man who believed a signature was a promise, started Cousins Holdings in 1973 with a commercial cleaning contract and a second-hand floor buffer he bought from a school janitor who was retiring. My grandfather, Earl Cousins, worked that first contract himself, 7 nights a week, a downtown office building in Charlotte that smelled like cigarettes and old carpet. He brought my father along on weekends, and my father learned early that the distance between nothing and something was not talent or luck or the right connections. It was showing up every time, without complaint. Earl died of a heart attack in 1989, and my father took over a company with 11 employees and 4 commercial contracts, and turned it, over the next 31 years, into a facilities management firm with 412 employees, contracts in 7 states, and an annual revenue of just over $41 million. He did it the way his father had done everything, methodically, patiently, and with a preference for people who knew how to work quietly and well over people who knew how to talk loudly and impressively. He had a portrait of Earl in the lobby, not a fancy oil painting, a framed photograph, 8 by 10, Earl in his uniform holding the floor buffer, grinning like a man who had just done something he was proud of. My father walked past that photograph every morning for 30 years and touched the frame, not dramatically, just a quick 2-fingered touch, the way you'd tap a table for luck. A habit. A conversation between the living and the dead. I grew up inside that company the way some kids grow up inside churches. It shaped the grammar of how I understood the world. I worked there every summer from age 14, starting in the mailroom and moving through 3 different departments before I graduated college. I knew the names of the crew supervisors. I knew which accounts were difficult and why. I knew that the Henderson contract in Greensboro had almost collapsed in 2003 because of a billing dispute, and that my father had driven there personally, sat down across from the facility manager, and resolved it with a handshake and a formal written apology that he composed himself. I left the company at 26 to pursue my own career in nonprofit management, a decision my father supported entirely because he was, above everything, a man who believed that people had to build their own thing. Your grandfather's company isn't yours until you've earned something somewhere else first, he told me. Come back when you've got calluses. I came back at 32 with a director title, 10 years of grant writing and organizational development behind me, and Henry Gale, my husband. I should describe him the way I understood him then, which is different from how I understand him now, because fairness requires that I not flatten a 28-year marriage into a villain origin story. When I met Henry, he was 35, sharp, funny, and genuinely impressive in rooms, the kind of man who had the unusual ability to make complex things sound simple, and to make the person he was talking to feel like the most interesting individual in the building. He had an MBA from Wake Forest and 10 years of operations experience. He was good with people and better with numbers. He could walk into a room full of skeptics and walk out with 3 of them converted. My father liked him. That mattered more to me than it should have. He's smart, my father said, after the first time they had dinner together. My father didn't elaborate because he wasn't an elaborating man, but he said it with the particular quality of approval he reserved for things that had actually impressed him, and I filed it away. The early years of the marriage were good, not perfect. Henry was ambitious in ways that sometimes made him difficult to live with, and I was independent in ways that sometimes made me difficult to live with, but genuinely good. We had Georgia. We built a life. Henry came to work at Cousins Holdings at 40, in a VP of operations role, and proved himself there in the way he proved himself everywhere, by being very, very good at the parts of the job that were visible. The first red flag, looking back, was so small that I genuinely didn't recognize it as a flag at all. My father had a phrase he used when he wanted to acknowledge someone's work without overstating it. That was solid. It was high praise from him. Not the highest, but high. He said it to Henry after Henry restructured the West Coast logistics operation in 2017 and saved the company roughly $800,000 in annual overhead. Henry heard it as the highest. I noticed that he had heard it differently from how it was meant. I noted it, the way you note a slightly off note in a song. Not alarming, just slightly wrong. And then I moved on, because I was good at that. Moving on, assuming the best. Extending the benefit of the doubt to the man I had married and loved and built a life with. I extended it for longer than I should have. My father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in January of 2020. Stage 3, catching the outer edge of operable, which his oncologist, Dr. Meredith Okafor, 22 years of practice at Atrium Health, the kind of doctor who gives you information in the same tone regardless of whether it's good or terrible, described as a narrow window with real options. He went through surgery. He went through 8 months of chemotherapy. He lost 40 pounds and his hair. And, temporarily, the steadiness of the hands that had touched Earl's portrait frame every morning for 30 years. He did not slow down. Or rather, he slowed his body and accelerated everything else. He spent those 8 months of treatment doing something I only understood in retrospect. He was organizing. Not in a sentimental getting affairs in order way, in the specific, meticulous, operational way of a man who understood that the most important decisions he would ever make were the ones he made right now, while he still had the clarity to make them correctly. In September of 2020, my father called Henry and me into his study. The room smelled like old wood, and the particular brand of instant coffee my father had drunk every morning since 1981. There were 2 documents on the desk. August Delmore of Delmore and Crane, PA, who had been my father's corporate attorney for 17 years, and was the kind of lawyer who wore reading glasses he refused to upgrade because he claimed the slightly blurry periphery helped him focus on what mattered, sat in the corner chair with his briefcase on his lap. My father explained the documents. The first transferred operational control of Cousins Holdings to Henry Gale as CEO, with a structured equity arrangement that gave Henry a 30% ownership stake, effective immediately. The company remained Cousins Holdings. The transfer was real and binding. The second document was spousal consent. Standard procedure, because Henry and I were married, my signature was required to confirm I had no personal claim that conflicted with the transfer. Henry signed his document. I signed mine. Henry nodded, pocketed his pen, shook my father's hand, and then August's, and said something about being honored and not taking the trust lightly. He was good in that moment. Gracious. Appropriate. He said the right things in the right order with the right amount of gravity. He left the study first, and I stayed behind to hug my father, and the last thing my father said to me before I walked out was this: I love you, Cresa. You've always known how to wait for the right moment. I thought it was just a father saying something kind to his daughter. I didn't understand it yet. My father died on March 4th, 2021 at 7:22 in the morning, in the bedroom of the house he had lived in for 44 years. I was there. Georgia was there. Henry was not. He was on a conference call with the West Coast operations team, which he had scheduled for 7 a.m., and which I found out about only after. I do not know whether that scheduling was careless or intentional. I have thought about it a great many times and I still don't know, and I have decided that not knowing is acceptable because it doesn't change anything that followed. Henry was, outwardly, appropriately grieved. He spoke at the funeral. He said good things. He talked about my father's vision and his patience and the privilege of learning from him. Several people told me afterward that the eulogy was beautiful. I thanked them. 14 days after my father's funeral, the sign above the entrance to the building on Moorhead Street, the building Earl Cousins had won his first contract to clean in 1973, the building my father had bought outright in 1994 and poured 3 years of renovation into, the building with Earl's photograph in the lobby, was changed. Cousins Holdings came down, Gale Enterprise Group went up. I found out from Georgia, who drove past it on a Wednesday morning and called me from the parking lot with the specific kind of silence on the line that means a person cannot find words that are adequate to what they're looking at. I called Henry. He answered from my father's office, and he explained, with the patience of a man explaining something obvious, that a rebrand was operationally necessary, that Cousins Holdings was associated with the old model, that Gale Enterprise Group better reflected the direction he intended to take the company, that my father had given him full operational authority, and this was an operational decision. I said, what happened to my grandfather's portrait? A brief pause. It's in storage, Cresa. We can talk about displaying it somewhere appropriate. Somewhere appropriate. Earl Cousins, who had worked that floor buffer 7 nights a week so that his son could have a life, was in storage. I got off the phone, sat at my kitchen table. Georgia was across from me, and she looked the way she had looked as a small child when she witnessed something she couldn't make sense of. Not crying, but very, very still, filing something away somewhere permanent. I told myself Henry would come around, that grief did strange things to people, that the rebrand was tone-deaf but not malicious, that 28 years of marriage had to account for something. I was wrong about almost all of that. The Charlotte Business Journal feature ran 6 weeks later, full spread. Henry in a charcoal suit, a very good charcoal suit, the kind of suit that communicates a certain version of who a person wants you to think they are, sitting at my father's desk in my father's corner office, the office that still had the same wooden file cabinet my father had owned since 1987. The photographer had, I noticed, positioned Henry so that the file cabinet was out of frame. The journalist was a woman named Paula Stearns, 8 years at the Journal, solid business reporter, not the type to be handled easily. But Henry was very good in rooms, and he was good in that interview. He talked about vision, he talked about legacy, he talked about the privilege of being entrusted by a great mentor with something important. He did not say my father's name, not once in the entire 1,200-word article. Not Franklin Cousins, not Frank, not even the founder. Just a great mentor and the previous leadership and the foundation that was laid before my tenure. Georgia read it at my kitchen table, both hands flat on the surface, jaw set. She looked up at me. He's rewriting it, she said. He's rewriting how it happened. I folded the newspaper, placed it in the drawer, said nothing, because somewhere in the back of my mind, in the part that my father had trained without my realizing it, I understood that reacting was exactly what Henry expected. That a public argument, an emotional confrontation, a daughter and wife making a scene about a business profile, that was a story Henry could manage. That was terrain he had prepared for. So I said nothing, and Henry took my silence for surrender. Quick pause. If you want more stories like this in better quality, my Spotify's linked in the description. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday morning in November 2022. Plain envelope. My name once, near the top. Respondent. 14 pages. 28 years of marriage, and I was a respondent. I sat with them at the kitchen table for a long time. Not crying. I want to be clear about that, because I think people expect a woman in this situation to cry, and there's nothing wrong with crying. But what I felt was not grief or shock. It was something colder and more clarifying. The sensation of something you had been half expecting, finally arriving, and the strange relief of no longer having to half expect it. The accompanying letter was from Henry's attorney, Reginald Marsh of Marsh & Associates, a firm known specifically in Charlotte legal circles for high-asset divorce proceedings, which told me Henry had been planning this for some time. The letter outlined Henry's position, that Cousins Holdings, Gale Enterprise Group, it called it throughout, never using my family's name, was his by virtue of the signed transfer documents, that my spousal consent had been fully executed, and that my claim to any portion of the company's assets was legally foreclosed. He was offering me the house and a settlement, a number I won't specify here, except to say it was the kind of number that looks generous until you understand it represented approximately 4% of what the company was worth. The house my grandfather had never visited because he died before my parents bought it, the house that had no portrait of Earl on its walls. He was offering me the house and calling it fair. I put the letter back in the envelope, called Georgia. She was at my door in 40 minutes. We sat together and I told her everything, and she was quiet for a long time after I finished. And then she said, "Mom, fight this." "I know," I said. "Do you have anyone? A lawyer?" I thought about that. "I need to make a call first," I said. I went to the kitchen drawer, the same drawer where I had put the folded newspaper. At the back, behind a takeout menu and a grocery receipt and the accumulated small debris of a functional life, there was a note, handwritten, my father's handwriting, the careful, deliberate cursive of a man who believed a signature was a promise. "Your father was a thorough man." A phone number, August Delmore's personal line. My father had slipped it into my coat pocket the day of his diagnosis when I was leaving the house, and I had transferred it without reading it into the kitchen drawer during the chaotic weeks that followed, and there it had sat for 2 years. I dialed. August answered on the second ring, like he'd been waiting. August Delmore's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, 4 blocks from the Moorhead Street building with the sign Henry had changed. He was 63, compact, silver-haired, and had the particular quality of stillness I associate with people who have spent their careers reading documents that other people wish hadn't been read. He shook my hand, poured coffee without asking, set a brown envelope on the desk between us. "Your father came to see me," he said, 2 weeks after the signing. I looked at the envelope. "Alone?" "Alone." August folded his hands. He had me draft a separate document. He asked that it be kept entirely confidential, not filed in a manner that would surface in any standard title search or corporate records review. It required some creativity on my part, but it was entirely legal. Your father was very clear about that. He wanted it done right. He slid the document across. I read it once, then again, then a third time, because the third time was when my hands stopped trembling enough to let the words settle. A spousal equity trust. 49% beneficial interest in Cousins Holdings. The document used my family's name throughout, not Henry's rebrand. Held in trust for Creasa Cousins Gale. 1 trigger condition. Divorce proceedings initiated by Henry Gale. 1 window. 180 days from the date of filing. I looked up at August. "When were the papers filed?" He told me the date. I counted backward, then forward. 7 days. I had come with 7 days remaining in the window. "Your father said," August continued, and here he paused in the careful way of a man who is about to deliver something exact, that if you didn't come, to let it expire. "He said it was your life and your choice. He said he would not make the decision for you. My father had built the door, framed it, hung it, left the knob on my side. He had trusted me to decide whether to open it." I looked at August Delmore, at this man who had held this secret for 2 years in the patient, professional way of someone who understood that some documents are not just paperwork, but time capsules, promises from the dead to the living, and I picked up the pen. "Tell me what I need to sign," I said. I hired my own attorney the following morning. Diane Whitfield of Whitfield & Barons, 31 years in family and corporate law, former clerk for the 4th Circuit, the kind of lawyer who wears no jewelry except plain stud earrings and communicates exclusively in declarative sentences. She reviewed the trust documents for 4 hours. She called me at 9:47 p.m. "This is airtight," she said. "Are you sure? Your father's attorney did this very carefully. The trust predates Henry's rebrand, which means it references the original entity under its original name, and there is an explicit provision that any successor entity holding substantially the same assets is subject to the same beneficial interest. Henry renamed the company. He didn't restructure it. The assets are the same assets. A pause. Henry's attorney is good, but he was looking for the wrong thing. He thought the signed transfer documents were the whole picture. Diane confirmed. They were the whole picture Henry saw. Your father made sure there was a picture Henry never saw. I sat in my kitchen, in the quiet of a house that felt different now. Not smaller, but more precisely sized, the right dimensions for the life I was about to build. And I thought about my father at August's desk 2 weeks after that signing, while he was still in the middle of chemotherapy, while his hands were still unsteady, drafting a document he would never see used, for a contingency he hoped would never occur, for a daughter he trusted completely without telling her he did. I love you, Creasa. You've always known how to wait for the right moment. I hadn't known what I was waiting for. He had. The hearing was on a Tuesday. I wore a navy dress and my grandmother's earrings. Georgia drove me and waited in the hallway outside the courtroom, and when I walked past her, she gripped my hand for 2 seconds without speaking, which was exactly right. Henry was already seated when I came in. He had Reginald Marsh beside him, tall, silver-templed, the practiced posture of a man who bills $400 an hour and knows how to look like he's worth it. Henry himself was in a dark suit, and he was sitting the way he sat in that newspaper photograph, comfortably, with the certainty of a man who has already cataloged the room and found nothing to worry about. He glanced at me when I entered, a brief, dismissive glance, the kind a person gives someone they've already accounted for. He did not look worried. The judge was the Honorable Patricia Wynne, 26 years on the bench, family court and civil division, known in Charlotte legal circles for a complete intolerance of procedural games and a photographic memory for case documents. Diane had told me that Judge Wynne read everything, every exhibit, every attachment, every footnote. Good, Diane had said. That's exactly what we want. The hearing began with standard asset review. Reginald Marsh presented Henry's position with the confidence of a man working from a very thorough brief. The transfer documents, the spousal consent, the operational history of Gale Enterprise Group, the argument that my claim to the company had been legally extinguished. He was thorough. He was precise. He was extremely good. And none of it accounted for what Diane submitted at 10:23 a.m. I watched the clerk carry the exhibit binder to the judge's bench. Watched Judge Wynne open it to the trust document. Watched her begin to read with the same focused stillness August had in his office. The stillness of someone who understands they are looking at something that changes the shape of things. The silence in that courtroom was different from any silence I'd experienced before. Not the silence of waiting. The silence of a room collectively realizing that the story it believed it was in was not the story that was actually happening. Reginald Marsh's pen stopped moving. Henry was watching the judge. I watched Henry. I watched the moment he understood. It didn't arrive all at once. It came in stages, the way light changes at the end of a long afternoon. A small shift, then another, then the sudden full awareness of how far the day had moved without him noticing. His jaw tightened. His shoulders changed. Something left his posture that had been there when he walked in. Some structural certainty that had been holding him upright, and without it he looked, for the first time in as long as I could remember, genuinely uncertain. Judge Wynne looked up. She read one line from the trust document, aloud, in the level, unhurried voice of a woman who has been doing this for 26 years and has no interest in theater. 49% beneficial interest in Cousins Holdings, née Gale Enterprise Group, held for Creasa Cousins Gale, activated upon filing of divorce proceedings by Henry Gale. Reginald Marsh set his pen down. Henry turned and looked at me. Really looked. Not the dismissive glance from when I entered. Not the calibrated consideration of a man assessing an opponent. Something else entirely. Something I recognized, with complicated emotions, as the look of a person finally seeing what was in front of them after years of choosing not to look. He looked like a man who had walked confidently into a building and discovered, only now, that the foundation beneath it belonged to someone else. That it had always belonged to someone else. That the name on the sign didn't change what the building was built on. I held his gaze. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. Because my father had spent 30 years teaching me that you don't perform when the work is already done. What followed the hearing took several months to resolve in full. Diane was precise about what I was and wasn't entitled to, and equally precise about what the trust made unavoidable. Henry's attorneys attempted 2 separate challenges, one questioning the validity of the trust's confidential filing, one arguing that the rebrand constituted a sufficiently different entity to fall outside the trust's provisions. Both failed. The first, because August Delmore's work was meticulous. The second, because Diane had anticipated it, and the trust document contained explicit successor language that my father had, apparently, been very specific about including. Your father was a thorough man. That was what the note said. That was what the note had always said, and I finally understood why he'd written it. The settlement took another 4 months. I won't detail every term, because some of it is still under agreement and some of it is simply private. What I will say is this: 49% of a $41 million company is not a small number, and Diane Whitfield is very, very good at her job. Henry kept his 30%. He kept the CEO title for the time being, because the operational structure made that the cleanest resolution in the short term. But Cousins Holdings, and the judge's order was explicit on this point following Diane's filing. Cousins Holdings had to be restored as the operating name. The rebrand had to be reversed within 90 days. days. I was told the new signage went up on a Wednesday. Georgia drove past it. She called me from the parking lot. She was crying. Not with grief this time. The other kind. 1 year later. Earl Cousin's photograph is back in the lobby. Not the same frame. The original was damaged in storage, in a way that I suspect was not entirely accidental, though I have chosen not to pursue that question. It's a new frame. Same photograph. 8x10, Earl in his uniform, holding the floor buffer, grinning like a man who just did something he was proud of. I donated 10% of my settlement to the Facilities Workers Union that covers commercial cleaning contracts in Mecklenburg County. My father would have done that. My grandfather would have understood why. Georgia is a corporate attorney now. 3rd year at a firm in Charlotte, recently promoted, specializing in exactly the kind of trust and estate work that makes people like Henry very nervous. She says it's not related. She says it with the dry smile she's had since she was 14, the one that means she knows exactly what she's saying. I go to the building on Moorhead Street sometimes. Not often. I don't work there. That was never what this was about. I walk through the lobby. I look at Earl's photograph. Sometimes I touch the frame, 2 fingers, the way my father did every morning for 30 years. A habit. A conversation between the living and the dead. Henry called me once, about 4 months after the settlement. He wanted to talk. He said he wanted to explain himself. He said the things people say when the consequences have arrived and the armor has come off and they're left with whatever is actually underneath. I listened. At the end I said, Henry, my father gave you something extraordinary. The only thing he couldn't give you was the character to deserve it. He didn't respond. I didn't need him to. My grandfather built this company with a mop and a bucket in a time and a city that did not make that easy, driven by nothing but the belief that work and patience and showing up every single day were enough to build something that lasted. He was right. 49% of it just came home.